Bueno,
Okay, so there are three elements for debate. Here I am posing three possible answers to the questions. Of course, these are questions, these are open questions, some of which, of course, the international part have accumulated ideas that answer the question. First of all, the subject of states, the force of states. We have a debate amongst ourselves, right? But anyway, what we can say is that states have not only survived, but they have been reinforced, they have strengthened themselves because the chain and the accumulation and the logic of accumulation, as Harvey says, is a logic that is more international, that is more globalized. And then exploitation doesn't happen for political reasons by themselves, because exploitation, because they are not articulated, so it cannot happen internationally. And so the big organizations, global organizations of trade, of finance, of healthcare, of an attempt of social policies. We are in this era of United Nations, of IMF, of OTAN, NATO. And so there is a bigger importance of those supra-imperialist organizations, supranational organizations. And as our documents of the 14th Congress of FI said, the force of the regional blocs like NAFTA in North America, the European Union treaties, Mercosur, which is a treaty that aren't particularly imperialist countries, but there isn't in any way a supranational state. And so the fact that they exist doesn't mean that there is a supranational state. But at the end of the 20th century, there was a crisis due to this contradiction between the logic of the accumulation of capital and the logic, the territorial crisis of the states. And so there's this crisis. There's a permanent contradiction between the needs of the bourgeois to exploit nationally and the pressures of the economy that is more and more internationalized and globalized. These are some excerpts from our document of the Congress of 95 that talks about precisely this issue. I will read out these three excerpts. The existing states remain the necessary form of class domination, but they are already no longer the appropriate form in terms of the main tendencies of globalization. This explains that destabilization of the ruling of classes and their political personnel that we have seen since the beginning of the century. This is an insight of the direction of the fourth at the time, with Ben Said's guidance, of course. This contradiction produces a crisis in the domination of classes, a political crisis. This is a tendency, a trend of our era. What is exactly different nowadays in imperialism? This is one of the few consensus in Marxist debates. It isn't Lenin's biggest concern in this 17th book. The direct confrontation between imperialists states like in the 20th. It doesn't mean that there aren't any wars, that there isn't this trend to genocide, to war, to death. That we still have that, but Claudio Katz talks about this. It's not that that we don't have this war feature, but they have transferred this war need to the periphery. We see this in the Syrian war, for example. We see the end of the chapter of Afghanistan, which has great importance, and it needs to be discussed regarding what will be American imperialism after that. And we talk about other differences here. There is a consensus that, of course, it's not an American imperialism, but there is a supremacy, a hegemony, a disproportionate force of North American imperialism in our times. At the same time, there are new ways to the classic colonialism, as in Africa, as in Asia, as in Latin America. The freedom of Latin America came in early, but this has given way to a new way of exploitation of the people, of the resources. And Harvey talks about this in detail, and this has to do with the new ways of exploitation, the other ways of accumulation, debt, for example, external debt and internal debt. American control, complete American control over the currency. This allows financial markets to attack what they call speculation attacks whenever they feel like, whenever it's in their best interest. They attack medium economies, like they have done with Indonesia, with Korea in the 90s, for example. Changes in trade, which are more draconian than in the past. Health barriers to trade, patents, for example.
So there are many different forms of new forms of exploitation and the absolute theft of riches and wealth. And I'm going to simplify enormously here because it's a very important topic. It's a whole book by Harvey about accumulation by dispossession. He recognizes that this is not something new. it's a form of tribute, and he does, as his first insight is that has to do with Rosa Luxemburg's insight about accumulation of capital. And I think it's very important that we read him because he recognizes Hannah Arendt's contribution in her book, her text about imperialism in her book about totalitarianism. And so he talks a lot about dispossession and all the kinds and forms of dispossession. And there's a mercantilization. I'm going to read a little to give you the privatization of the earth, land, water, everything. So imperialist capitalism needs new external elements to be able to channel its need to invest and have more profitable investments. So he thinks that aside from this accumulation by dispossession, he looks at all the labor reforms, all of the reforms about labor rights, all the reforms about rural life, for example. I don't know if the comrade from India is present today, but there's a new attempt to dispossess peasants in India. And all of these elements make up for Harvey the accumulation by dispossession. This is not new. He takes it from the famous primitive accumulation, original accumulation of capitalism, which is in chapter 24 of the third volume of Capital, when Marx describes how dispossession has been necessary for the English to be able to actually have their industrial revolution. So he talks about this, and he also takes, if we look at Harvey and Arendt doing this kind of a summary, this is not primitive or original. This is permanent. It's a permanent theft by imperialists of the markets and in order to be able, or sorry, resources in order to be able to continue accumulating and reproducing capital. In addition to this general characteristics, I include other important issues so that we can think about today's world. It's the third point, important debates about the configuration of the world, of the today's imperialist world. There's a discussion with the Marxists of dependency theories. Well, there are others, but I'm talking about the Marxists because we're interested in debating with them about the whether it's appropriate to say that the world is divided into center and periphery with no mediations. It is very important for us in Latin America and those in Africa and Asia, of course. So what is happening here? In his book, Katz, which is in the bibliography, defends this thesis. He's very correct when he says that imperialism and capitalism continue to maintain hierarchy and the exploitation of the poor by the rich and the centers by the periphery by the center, but he doesn't admit that the problem is that the world is a little more complicated than the difference between center and periphery. So he doubts the characterization of intermediate states socioeconomic and intermediate countries and social political formations. And Wallerstein, for example, proposes this. And there are countries, middling countries like Brazil or India, South Korea, for example, South Africa, which are not peripheral. They have a lot of characteristics of being peripheral, but they also have characteristics of regional powers vis-a-vis their neighbors. We call this sub-imperialism. So in our last World Congress, we said, and this is a debate amongst Marxists, that it's insufficient to say that there are only two categories, only center and periphery, that's out of date. And because we can see countries that are that used to be on the periphery, like China, who are now becoming central. So, and there's another debate that's very important here in Latin America. We see this a lot, where people are talking about the recolonization, like Katz talks about. I think that's a little exaggerated. It's too much of a generalization. First of all, because there are countries that never stop being colonies, not in the 19th century sense of the word, but they're countries that are completely exploited. So you can't recolonize something that's already a colony. And secondly, there are these countries that are middling countries. For example, Bolsonaro's proposal for Brazil is to eliminate it as some kind of regional power, but this is a whole discussion. We can talk about, can we talk generically about a world like this in terms of colonization that existed until the mid-20th century. But in any case, what we do have in the Fourth International and have accumulated as part of our thinking is that it's not enough to talk about just center and periphery. It doesn't explain the world. So the truth is, I'm going to have to jump ahead and not talk about neoliberalism in the political sense. We can talk about that later. But the other aspect of the situation of imperialism today is that there's an ascent or a rise of new powers with the restoration of capitalism in China and in Russia, that what used to be the Soviet Union, that is all of the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. In this crisis in the last 20 years, we can say that the situation of Russia and China, there are different situations. So Russia is an imperialist country. China is an imperialist country, and Russia is a regional power, which has influence over its historical sphere of influence, which is thousands of years old with the Tsarist domination. So it's part of this new imperialist horizon today. The existence of these countries, these are countries that are disputing power with the United States, or dominance with the United States, hegemony with the United States. And there's a rebirth in all the imperialist countries and also in the non-imperialist countries as a response to a globalization of nationalism and protectionism, as has been the case in the United States with Trump. And this is a response, and we will see here, this is a response to of the right wing of the bourgeoisie to globalization. Another characteristic is the rise and emergence of these post-fascist movements. Ennio Traverso uses the term post-fascism, and some of the French theorists use other terms. And of course, there is a dispute, a brutal dispute for economic power, but also in the military sphere between the United States and China. The third issue, the third stage about imperialism, of the debate about imperialism today is about these two debates. What do the new what are these new traits, or what are these new tendencies represent? And what does this mean in the left? Well, we say that there is a dispute or a crisis between two projects of the imperialist bourgeoisie. One is in the United States, but also in Europe. And according to Michel Lowy, I'm not familiar with Japan in this. Michel Lowy says it's also expressed by the Japanese government. They express a need to respond to the crisis of globalization through going back to xenophobia, nationalism, racism, explicit racism, the struggle against migrants, all kinds of people who are different. So I could read to you this part of our international report at the IC. There's one project, the neoliberal project, that has been in place since the 1980s, and all the big governments from the imperialist countries, and also in South America, Menem, Enrique, etc. And now there's another project, a different one, even more different, more autocratic response. As we say, these are revolts against globalization, and they're expressed as revolts against modernity. So I've illustrated this with Trump, who has been the most expressive of this aspect. Modi, Bolsonaro, Duterte, the Hungarian fellow, the Polish government, post-fascist movements in certain countries, like in the Spanish state, in France. It's a generalized phenomenon. It's not just something that happens in the imperialist countries, but also in the developing countries, or the backward countries, however you want to call them. And it's a dispute between inter-bourgeois projects. And there's also the participation of the Indian bourgeoisie, the Brazilian bourgeoisie, the Philippine bourgeoisie. So it's a global dispute. These are definitions, and I can I can show you, I can send you these. They're different in different languages, but there are definitions of post-fascism. I think that everyone here is familiar, unfortunately, with this tactic. Now, there is another debate. I don't know if this exists in Europe or the United States. I think it's less present in the United States. But there's a very big debate in Latin America, for example, and I'm sure that this is also exists in Asia and Africa, about what is China. It's very important, as there's a whole sector of the campists, all the Stalinists and the ex-Stalinists or the neo-Stalinists, who think that China is a socialist country. That is, they repeat the discourse and the narrative of the Chinese Communist Party, that leads this transformation of China into an imperialist country. What I have put here on the screen is a situation. This is an article by Pierre Rousset about what China is, and it's a very, very harsh debate. Particularly, there are comrades here particularly from the communist parties here in Latin America, who defend China as, my God, a new kind of socialism. And all of our struggle, imagine all of our struggles. So first of all, we say that China is predominantly, what rules in China is the law of value, even though we have some kind of state capitalism, or a capitalism centralized by a very anti-democratic state, but it's a very, very lively capitalism. It's very strong. And this has made it possible, with the enormous reserves of labor and the backwardness with uneven development and all the backwardness that they have, it's made it, but decentralization has made it possible for the entire country to turn into an industrial power and now a technological power. And it has been able to come face to face with the United States. China is no longer a producer of crappy little pieces of commodities. It is a huge, cutting edge industry today, and particularly high tech. So particularly with regard to 5G, for example. So that possibility is that China, which is the beginning of the century, is might have been a rather hazy at the beginning of the century, but today there's absolutely nobody who could think that China is anything else but at least a strong something. She didn't finish that sentence. And it does have an expansionist policy, but the militarization and the attempts at control of the China Sea and all the area of the Silk Route through Russia is very characteristic of imperialism. Is what we know as a characteristic of imperialism.
On the current crisis, in this beginning of century crisis, we are facing a deeper chapter of the crisis that started in 2007 and 8 with the financial crisis in housing market in the US that made all the recession and the salvation imperative in the Obama era. What we've seen, it's not my personal opinion, it's more or less in the agreements that we achieved in the last International Committee of the FI, what we've seen, we've seen an unseen articulation and convergence of at least 3 crises that were articulating in an explosive way and then at the same time. In the first time, the ecological crisis, that there are less space for climate negationism, and environmental crisis, it's in the roots of the pandemics, of course, and this can explain also the current economical crisis now. The pandemic makes deeper an economic crisis. With the pandemics and the needs of the lockdowns in many present activities, the overaccumulation crisis goes deeper. And especially with banking and financial system have less conditions for making saving operations as in the case of the 2008 and 9 years. So we are having also an economic crisis that is reflected in the debt, in the jobs, and in the difficulties for going out of recession. Capitalist press, for example, is saying that we are recovering, yes, but the recovering is very questionable because the new recovering of economics comes after a deep depression. The social and political crisis, the crisis of the bourgeois state, of the so-called bourgeois democracies, and in the front of them, at least from 2019, before the pandemic, a strong reappearance of generalized resistance. In 2019, before the pandemic, we've seen struggles for democracy against some neoliberal policies in 42 countries. And with the climate strikes and the feminist demonstrations in the last 3 or 4 years, it's a resurgence of people that are on the street. That does not mean that we'll go for a very progressive point from the point of view of political conscience, because there's the problem of conscience, of defeats, and the crisis of the socialist alternative, but there's a strong rise up of the people against what's happening. And the geopolitical crisis, a geopolitical crisis that has one of their expression in the transition, but it's not a smooth transition. It's a very conflicted transition on what can be a new hegemonic from China in the international level. This hegemony from China, it doesn't exist anymore yet, China is rising up imperialism, and there is a kind of transition. There's a dispute in politics and in economics and geopolitical and ideological dispute between the China and the US. Of course, all these kind of crises are interrelated in a dialectical way, one between other. I would like to finish with this. These questions have consequences in terms of program because we are not an academics. We are not here for studying imperialism in terms of academic concepts and so on only. They have political and programmatic consequences. For example, if we conclude, I will make a closer example to myself, but maybe in Europe, Asia, or the US, you can make some other examples. If we conclude that China it's an imperialism, that has direct consequences in how we make our everyday politics. For example, how in Asia the cameras can face up the China domination. Here in Latin America, China is quite present. If, for you to have an idea, China, they have the 50% of energy generation in Brazil. Here, we are close because climate change. We are close to a new control of energy that can be the final destruction of Bolsonaro, hopefully. But this is related with the China companies because they control the 50% of energy production. It's more than other Latin American countries. And also that happens more or less in Venezuela. So that has programmatic consequences. What we do in relationship with these new political subjects in these demonstrations in the last 2 or 3 years, how we answer, what program we have looking for the unification of these new struggles. Is this possible an alliance of the new movements, the feminist movement, the anti-racist movement, and the old union and new union movement of the app workers and so on? All these changes have direct implications in our program that we as revolutionary rise up. Of course, that's not the topic today, but I want to stress that you can read the document of the last Congress, Geopolitical Chaos, and the document of the last IC. And just for finishing, I propose you as a way of thinking and general reflection for the new period, some more new questions that many Marxists have been debating on imperialism. For example, there's a strong debate on the so-called app and platformization, a platform capitalism or surveillance capitalism because of information tech. What will be, are, and will be the impacts of this new tech in everyday life, in how classes are constituted, in the neoliberal attacks against the working class, in how the left wing operates and the social movements under these new ways.
So just to finish, I talked about the questions of new the new situation of capitalism in the imperialism era. And all of this has to do with the reorganization of work. And this has to do, of course, with a question that many people talk about. Are the fintechs, these big monsters, controlled by the states? Will there be a new imperialistic war, the possibility of a new imperialistic war between the US and China? If this worry of Lenin is again current. How far will post-fascism go? We have had a big victory of the peoples and of democracies and of workers, of course, with the defeat of Trump. But post-fascism isn't dead. They were weakened by Trump's defeat, but how do we face them and how do we defeat them? And lastly, what is the role and where do the big struggles that we are facing go? Those big struggles that we are living, for example, here in Chile, in Colombia, in Latin America in general, and in other democratic struggles, like we have seen in Belarus, in Thailand, in Myanmar. And so this wave of new struggles, where do they go? What are the limits? And that is it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the language barrier, and I am ready for any questions that you may have.